Hello. In this video, I'm going to explain how the what is the responsibility of initiate transaction. So let's see. This is our validation service. This is now we are creating this processing service. This is Stripe provider service, and this is our Stripe PSP. Right? This is validation service. This is processing service, and this is the Stripe provider service, and this is Stripe PSP. See, and here is the merchant system. Okay, this is our basic structure of our project. So we have already created this Stripe provider service, which has this create payment, this get payment, and this expire payment services. Okay, and in the processing service we have already created the create transaction API, and second, now we are coding in this video some of the logic of this initiate transaction. So this is create transaction, and this is initiate transaction. See how the flow goes. This merchant system gives the request to this validation service, then the this validation service calls to the processing service or makes call to this create transaction API. So the work of the create transaction is, this is the database of the processing service. So the work of the create transaction is to save the database. Yes, the work of the create transaction is save the transaction inside the database with created status, and generate one unique ID transaction reference and give it back to this validation service. So it generates the transaction reference here, which is the unique ID, and this is send back to the validation service. Then the validation service takes this transaction reference and gives call or make request to the initiate transaction API for initiating this transaction. So copy paste. Yes, the validation service uses this transaction reference and sends the request to the initiate transaction to initiate this transaction. Yes, then the first work of the initiate transaction is that update the database. Update the database, that means update the payment status from created to initiated. So one of the business logic of the initiate transaction is that it has to update the payment status to initiated inside the database. Yes. Then next, after updating the payment status as initiated, it calls the create, this is create session, create payment API of the Stripe provider service. So initiate transaction further makes this HTTP call, or we can say HTTP, or we can say the API call, or the HTTP call. So after updating the status as initiated, the initiate transaction sends request to the create payment and then this Stripe provider does its work. It gives call to the Stripe create a session API, uh, sends the request to the create session API for of this Stripe PSP. It gives, after in response, Stripe PSP gives the URL, yes, ID and the URL in response. Then this response sends back to this processing service with the URL. Yes, after receiving the URL, that means the transaction is initiated. So after receiving the URL, the next work of the processing service is that change the status of the payment to the pending status. Payment status, it should change the payment status to pending and further sends back the URL to this validation service, and validation service gives the URL to this merchant system, where this merchant system gets redirected to this Stripe hosted payment page. Yes. So in this video I'm gonna tell you the some of the coding of the initiate transaction. That the first business logic the initiate transaction does is that it has to update the payment status as initiated. So I'm showing this, how the initiate transaction update the payment status as initiated inside the database. So for this, yes, initiate transaction. So the first aim is update payment status to initiated. So how it does this? So as we know, we have some basic structure of this, that we have this okay, we have okay, it's okay, we have this okay, instead of that, so how is our flow? So as we know, the whatever the components need to change the status or update the payment status, they have to call what? Payment status service. Yes, we have this structure, that we have a payment controller. The payment control is nothing but the our REST controller. Then we have payment service, this is service layer. Then the payment service, we have this payment status service. So as I have explained in my one of the videos, that payment status service where I have explained the this factory design pattern. So our flow is payment controller goes to the service layer, payment service IMPL. Then whoever wants to update the status, payment status, for that we have we have followed the factory design pattern to design this concept and remove the complexity. So for this we have created payment status service, then we have created the payment status factory, and we have created the transaction status processor. So for this initiate transaction initiate transactions first work is update the payment status to initiated. So first work that from the payment service we need to call the payment status service. Yes, we know how we update the status inside the database, that we have this transaction DAO repository layer. So first we have to from payment status service we need to call the transaction DAO. See, initiate transactions concept is like see, to what transaction we update the status as initiated. That means that transaction has already been created. So in the create transaction we get the transaction reference. That means the unique ID which uniquely identifies each transaction. So we are taking that transaction reference so we need this transaction reference to update its payment status as initiated. Yes, initiated, we need to update the status as the initiated, but for what transaction? So for simplifying this we need the transaction reference. So based on that transaction reference it updates as the initiated, from created status to initiated status. So first work inside this update payment status, that we can say the 1.1 that we need to retrieve the transaction from transaction table which has transaction reference. That means what? That means select star from whatever our table is, payments dot transaction where transaction reference is equal to the transaction reference, given transaction reference. So this must be the query. So first we need to retrieve the transaction from transaction table. So how to retrieve this transaction from transaction table? So we know to the database the our transaction DAO is doing the means transaction DAO layer is communicating with the database, means all the CRUD operations we are performing that should be through the transaction DAO. So we need to create a method inside the transaction DAO. Let's call it get transaction by transaction reference, and to this method we are going to pass our transaction reference, of which the payment status we need to update as initiated. And what it returns? Yes, we know the rows of the table, the rows of the transaction table, and for the transaction table, to represent each and every row inside the transaction table, we have created a transaction entity class. Transaction entity. What is transaction entity class? We have created it for the transaction table. That means each object of the transaction entity represents each one object of the transaction entity represent a row inside the transaction table. So this code, this query goes inside this method. Let's select star from payments dot transaction, where transaction reference is this. Yes, and it should return what? The transaction entity object. Yes, after receiving that transaction entity object, that means now we have the entity, we have the row, we have the details of the transaction, for that for which we have to update the payment status as initiated. So this payment status service first calls the transaction DAO. Payment service. Okay. Okay, so first the payment controller calls the payment service, and then payment service for initiating transaction. Let's see here. Let's open the payment controller. So see, after receiving this post request, it maps to this initiate transaction. It then calls the initiate transaction of the payment service. where it goes inside the implementation. Inside this initiate transaction method. Yes, so first the payment service should call the transaction DAO to retrieve this entity, and further this transaction DAO gives back the transaction entity for which they have to update the initiated transaction. Then the payment service sends request to this payment status service. Yes, payment service then see here it gives back the object of transaction entity. Okay, transaction say payment controller goes to the payment service layer, then payment service calls the transaction DAO. The transaction DAO gets the transaction entity by referring this transaction reference and gives it back the transaction entity to this payment service. See, payment status service, what we need to call the payment status service. Let's go to the payment status service. So let's go to the implementation class of this. See, for payment status service we need transaction DTO object to call. So yes, we need to okay okay this is payment status service implementation. Okay, so let's delete this. Let's save it. Let's go back. Okay, see, payment status service is an interface and is implementation is overridden method should be the process payment. Oh sorry, it's one of the method is process payment. Okay, what I have said that we need to we need to call the transaction DAO from the payment service where it returns the transaction entity to the payment service. Then this payment service sends this transaction entity to payment status service. So let's see the payment status service. Control Shift R, payment status service. Yes, here payment status service. Here they have to process the payment. So let's go inside this. What we have done here, that it receives the transaction DTO object and converts it into the it retrieves the status. In our initiated state, the status is initiated, and then it converts it into enum object. Then it sends that enum object to the get status processor, to status factory. Yes, where it gives us the initiated status processor. Then all the business logic we are doing here, that it has to call the transaction DTO to update the transaction to update the transaction. So yes, you are getting payment service initiate transaction, payment service implementation. Yes, here. So here first sorry, yes, it is okay that call payment status service to process the status. Yes, but to call the payment status service we need the transaction DTO object, and for this transaction DTO, and we are, see here we are calling what, here we are calling transaction DTO to get what, transaction entity object. Yes. So here we are calling the transaction DTO, and from where it we receives the transaction entity object, and to call the payment status service we need transaction D. So we need here what, transaction DTO object of transaction DTO. See, we are receiving transaction entity, but for calling the payment status service we need the transaction DTO. So what we can do is, we have to convert this transaction entity into the transaction DTO, and we know we use for mapping this, we use the model mapper. Yes, we have added the model mapper, and we can convert this transaction entity into the transaction DTO with the help of the model mapper. So we can do this, we are doing this. Okay, then we call this payment status service with the transaction DTO object. After that, the payment status service calls the status factory. Yes, status processor factory. This payment status service further calls to the status processor factory. So what needs to the status processor factory? Let's check it. Status processor factory. Okay, the name is factory, status factory. Yes, payment status factory. So the inside the payment status factory we need the enum object. Yes, what we need, the enum object. Enum object of what? Transaction status, transaction status, enum object of transaction status. Here we need transaction status enum. Yes, for for that, inside the payment status service, we are receiving the transaction DTO, and we have to retrieve the payment status from this transaction DTO by using the get payment status method, and we should convert it into the transaction status enum, and then we need to send it to the status processor factory. So two conversions we have needed here. So first, by using model mapper, we need to convert transaction entity into the transaction DAO to pass it to the payment status service, and from in the payment status service we are using the enum converters, mapping converters we can use converters we have created to convert this string into the integer. That means, so what we do here, we we should retrieve the transaction status from DTO, and then by using the model mapper we convert this transaction status from string to ID. That means we are creating the enum object of that. Then we are passing it to the status processor, get status processor. So here, in case of our initiated use case, the status ID is 2. Yes, status transaction status ID is 2. So it calls the this case initiated and goes inside and returns the object of initiated status processor. Here what it returns, the status processor factory then responses with object of initiated status processor. It gives what? The initiated status processor. Oh shit. Yes. Status factory gives back the initiated status processor's object. Then the payment status service then call the transaction processor. Yes, as we know the factory, our factory design pattern. Then see, the payment status service calls the payment status factory, it gives the object, and then it calls with that object the transaction status processor, it calls the initiated status processor. So that means here, okay, it calls what? It then calls the initiated status processor. Then all the business logic goes here inside the initiate status processor. So to call the initiated status processor, what we need? Control Shift R, initiated status processor. So we need here again the transaction DTO, and we already have the transaction DTO. So we are sending the transaction DTO here. Yes, we can send the transaction DTO here. So the work of the initiated status processor is that it should call the transaction DAO. Yes, initiated status processor should call the transaction DAO, and here is our database. And then the transaction DAO layer has we are coding the payment status updation query inside the transaction DAO layer by creating one method. Then this transaction DAO, okay, let's see what should be the request structure for the transaction DAO. So let's go to the transaction DAO. Yes, here this insert transaction for saving the transaction inside the database. Here we have to create another method for update the transaction. Yes, for updating the transaction, and we have to pass the transaction entity which we have to update. So we have to pass here transaction entity, object of transaction entity. So the transaction DAO, we are creating here one method inside the implementation class of transaction DAO, the method for updating the payment status, the query for updating the payment status. Then this transaction DAO will directly update it inside the database. So these all the work we need to do for just to update the payment status to initiated status. So let's do it. So first we need to go to the payment service and then call the transaction DAO, and for calling transaction DAO we need this transaction reference. So in short, the payment service has to call the payment status service. For that, see, let's go to the payment service implementation. See, what we have to call the payment status service. So the same call is this, copy here, paste, payment status service dot process payment transaction DTO. So we need for this DTO calling transaction DAO to get the transaction entity object. So we need to call here transaction DAO. So first let's create this, the no, just set this transaction DTO for now null. Yes, what we have to do, we have to call the transaction DAO to retrieve the transaction entity, and then this entity should get converted to the DTO. So we are getting here transaction entity object, and how we get this? We have to call the transaction DAO. So for calling the transaction DAO, we should inject it inside the constructor by making it final. Already we have used the required hours constructor annotation for constructor injection. So transaction DAO to transaction DAO semicolon, control shift O. Okay, let's check the transaction DAO. Transaction DAO. Okay, DAO. Like this. Control shift O. We are adjusting the packages. So we have injected the transaction DAO inside the constructor of payment service implementation. Okay, so now here we have to call transaction DAO dot get transaction by reference. Save it, and we have to pass the transaction reference. Here we are already this initiate transaction receives the transaction reference. So for we need to create this method, yes, public, which returns the transaction entity, get transaction by reference, and we are passing the transaction reference. Let's save it, and we need to implement this. So let's go to the implementation class of DAO here, and here implement this. So what we need to code here? We need to code for what? To retrieve the transaction from transaction table, means retrieve the row from transaction table which has this transaction reference. This transaction reference we are passing. So let's search on the ChatGPT. I have already searched it. I have mentioned that, see, I am giving here all my table DDL and saying that this is my transaction table, and I want to receive the tuple from this table by transaction reference. And for this, please implement the following method. I am passing this method to ChatGPT, that this is my method and this is my table DDL, and I'm giving that use the named parameter, and I have same field names in database and entity. Yes, so it says that since your database column names and entity field name match, we can use the bean property row mapper. So okay, so we are using, yes, named parameter JDBC template. This is the JDBC template for named parameter. What is named parameter? See here, we are giving the name to the parameter. Generally we are giving the question marks inside the query. So if we can also use this named parameter, and for this the the JDBC library has this named parameter JDBC template. See here, it injects the named parameter JDBC template inside this repository class. Then yes, injected constructor injection, we do this by using the required as required as constructor annotation. Then this is our method. Yes, get transaction by reference, we are passing the transaction reference. So here is the query. Select star from payments transaction where transaction reference is this. Then it uses the map SQL parameter source for forming the parameters. So add the value transaction reference and then returning the transaction entity dot class, that means the object of transaction entity, where it use the query for object. See, for insert we have used the update method of the JDBC template, and for this select type queries we need to use the query for object method for the JDBC template for getting the row or entity from the table. So return JDBC template query for object. The parameters here are first the SQL query, this is the SQL query. Second is the parameters, that means this is the transaction reference we are passing to replace is inside this SQL query. And then it returns the bean property mapper and we need it of type transaction entity. So this is the code. So let's copy this code and let's go to our code and paste it here. That string SQL, we say that update query. Okay, update query, select star from payments. Okay, so for this we have to inject this named parameter JDBC template. So let's copy this and inject. Okay, we are already injected here named parameter JDBC template. For this insert SQL query, yes, we can create this SQL query here also and make it private, static final string. Okay, okay, let's keep it here also, let's keep it here only. String update query this select star from payments where transaction reference is this. Okay, let's adjust the packages for map SQL. So okay, we are using this update query, let's copy it and send it here. Params and this let's create here the extractor refractor extract a local variable called transaction entity, required transaction entity. Yes, yes, and we are returning this transaction entity. Okay, we have to refactor this extract local variable. Expression must be selected to achieve this refactoring. Okay, okay, we just extract a local variable transaction entity. Okay, Okay, here, and let's save it. Okay, okay, done. Let's save it. So it returns the transaction entity. Okay, let's go back. Let's go back to the payment service IMPL. So here we are getting the transaction entity. Let's log here to check the transaction entity, and next we have to map this transaction entity by using the model mapper. Yes, so this transaction entity gets converted into the transaction DTO, and this transaction DTO we have to pass here to the process payment. Yes, let's go to the process payment. So here it, see here, it receives the transaction status. Okay, let's check first. It's, yes, we got the transaction entity. Here we have to update the status ID to the initiated. Yes, for that use this copy transaction status for created initiated, save it. We have to set the transaction status, na? Yes, then transaction. Okay, let's got it. After converting it into the transaction DTO, we have set it as a initiated. We have to set it transaction DTO dot set transaction status to initiated. Yes. Yes, we have set here the transaction status to initiated, and then call call this process payment, and transaction reference. Here we are giving one log to check response from payment status service after initiation, the response, DTO response. Okay, okay, let's check the, let's start it in a debug mode. Run as, oh sorry, debug as Spring Boot app. Save and launch, select all. Okay. So it started. So let's this payment service implementation. Okay, first set the log here, then go inside this. Okay, doesn't need this fetched transaction entity. Then we set here the transaction status. Let's be printing here the transaction status. Then next is, let's go to the process payment. Let's set one. It's already set it here, so let's set here and see the response from status processor. Yes, so let's go back. Okay, here. Okay, let's first create the transaction. Okay, just take this created transaction and this initiated transaction. Let's paste it here. Send. Okay. Status not found. Okay, first we have to create the transaction. So send this. Okay, resume. So this is for creating transaction. The status, transaction status is created. Let's check on the, see here, transaction. So see, we have created this transaction. Now copy this transaction reference and check it for initiate. Paste it here. Initiate. Send. So let's check the log. Yes, it successfully entered the initiate transaction method. So initiate transaction called for this reference, and this is our request. Okay, this is okay. Resume. Now fetch the transaction payment controller, and this is from payment service. Okay, yes, we have entered inside the payment service implementation. Then next, fetch the transaction entity. See, id is 2, user id. Yes, that means get transaction by reference successfully returns the transaction entity of the mentioned transaction reference. So we are getting this as a transaction entity. Yes, it is okay. Then resume it. Next, from payment service, yes, transaction status set to initiated. Next, the transaction status has been set to initiated inside the transaction DTO object. Next, here we are calling the process payment. It calls the status factory and retrieve the status processor. So here we should get the object of initiated status processor. So let's check, resume it. So fetching process for transaction DTO. Okay, resume. Then retrieved status processor. Yes, we are successfully, it successfully returns the initiated status processors. That means we are receiving the initiated status processors object here. Okay. So till now is okay. The response from payment status service for after initiation, this payment status is initiated. So this payment status has been updated inside the DTO object. Now we have to update it inside the database, and for that, see, we done up to this. Yes, we called the status processor factory and we got the successful object of the initiated status processor. Next, what we need to do is, yes, it successfully called the initiated status processor also. No. Okay. So process payment, let's go to the process payment implementation. So here response from status processor. This response is sent back to this payment service implementation. No. I'm going to the process payment, and here we are calling the status factory for get status processor. So it gives the initiated status processors object. Yes. So response from status processor. Okay. The transaction entity is not successfully transferred to DTO. We need to use here the what? Converters. So let's go back to the payment status service implementation. Now here transaction status. Okay, we have to convert it. need to use here the converters. Transaction DTO model mapper. Here one log mapped transaction DTO from entity. See the model mapper. Okay, let's stop this debug mode first. This converters here na enum converters nahi, this is JSON util. Okay, no. Then the model mapper, let's check the model mapper. Okay, in app config, yes, we have configure here, so it returns the new model mapper. Okay, our work has been done up to the payment service implementation, that we got the correct initiated status processor. Now the further coding I am explaining in the next video, because here I have to add the converters to convert these integer fields to these string fields. So this is not mapping here. We are getting the transaction status at the end as the initiated, but this is somewhat I feel is inappropriate, so I have to do it, that I need to add some more converters. That here I have added the converters, but these converters are only one way, that it retrieves the ID and convert it into, it retrieves the string and convert it into the integer. Now we need that who receives the integer and converts it into the string. So we need to add some more converters here. And then the remaining part is that we received the status processor here, Excalidraw. Yes, we received the object of the status processor in the payment status service. Then next, yes, we called this initiated status service processor also. Now the this part is remaining, transaction DAO, that we have to write the update query here in the transaction DAO. So let's do it in the next video. So the content for the next video is first add some converters to convert ID to integer, and then then add the update transaction update payment status method inside this transaction DAO to update the status as initiated inside the database. So this part we'll cover in the next video. Thank you.